Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. This time last year, we were being warned to brace for a wave of insolvencies when government support was eventually withdrawn from businesses. The combination of the end of JobKeeper and the end of the insolvent trading moratorium for directors was expected to see a significant increase in the number of businesses in crisis. But it hasn't happened, with external administrations still down significantly. KordaMentha and the Turnaround Management Association of Australia have released their annual turnaround survey looking at the business environment in Australia and the outlook ahead. I spoke to James Wagg, Executive Director at KordaMentha, when last year's report was released. He joins me again this morning. James, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
A big question, how accurate were last year's predictions?
Mixed bag. So there were two key predictions from the survey last year. The first was that the uncertainty of 2020 would continue on to this year. And I think that's certainly been right. The less accurate prediction was that the market would actually bounce back and we'd see more distress in the market this financial year. And this bounce back was off the back of insolvencies in 2020 being 50% of what they were in 2019. And as you mentioned in your intro, the end of JobKeeper and the directors' moratorium were main reasons that were pointed to in this bounce back. And in reality, as you mentioned, we've actually seen insolvencies remain historically low and in line with 2020. And actually, the ongoing border closures and lockdowns have negatively impacted GDP, but businesses in light of this have remained incredibly resilient and government stimulus has been incredibly successful.
Okay, so is that the main reason why insolvencies are still so far below average?
Yes, the success of government stimulus is certainly one of the main reasons that's created, I guess, what we're calling an artificial normal, where funding is so easily accessible for businesses. But there are three other less known and less referenced reasons. The first being financiers' support and leniency. Mm-hmm. We've seen through the last 18 months, through either government pressure or reputational concern, but also cheap money, financiers have been incredibly lenient to their borrowers. Secondly, the market's seeing incredibly high liquidity and low interest rates, which is driving investors to pursue different markets for returns. One of the biggest beneficiaries of these trends have been private markets, which reportedly have around $27 billion in undeployed capital. And with limited opportunities available in the market, these parties are actually beginning to take more risks to deploy that capital and pay higher prices. The third factor actually is government leniency, and particularly that of the ATO. So in times of pressure, we often see businesses, the first creditor that is delayed or deferred is the ATO. Total liabilities to the ATO have actually been growing and are now sitting at almost $45 billion, which is 80% higher than just a couple of years ago. So with the ATO stopping pursuing debts, when they start again, which presumably they will, given that all this stimulus needs to be paid for, it will reduce liquidity in the market and give businesses less options.
Okay, I didn't know about the ATO. Is that a course that the ATO or the government has been deliberate in to not chase debts?
Yes, effectively that's right. There's been a moratorium effectively on pursuing debts to give businesses relief in the last 2 years or 18 months. And actually, we've just seen last month that the ATO have just started issuing warning notices again to creditors with large balances and that of over $100,000 and that have been outstanding for over 90 days. Yeah. So it'll take a while for this to flush through the system, the impact to flush through the system, but it's certainly something interesting to watch.
The other one, the financier support and leniency, that'll turn around reasonably soon as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sean. However, I think off the back of the Banking Royal Commission, traditional banks and non-bank lenders have really had an attitude of doing everything possible to support borrowers. And with the current cheap money, there seems to be alternate lenders who are willing to take on distressed debts if existing lenders want to cut ties.
Okay, so cash isn't a problem at the moment. We've got low rates, we've got supportive financiers, we've got, up until now at least, the ATO being fairly calm about chasing debts. The question then is, what are the biggest issues facing business right now?
You're right. Probably a really interesting fact that came out of the survey was that cash is not an issue for businesses. The three biggest pressures that were pointed to continue to be closed borders,
Right. Yep.
which have a direct impact on the key industries such as tourism, transportation, hospitality, also higher education. But they also they directly impact those industries, but that has a flow on to many other industries in the economy. The second factor is actually the knock-on impact of labour forces on supply chains. And there were two good examples of this last week. The first being the Port of Melbourne, which faced union strikes, but at the same time faced 20% of their labour force being quarantined for COVID reasons. And these delays are quite isolated to the Port of Melbourne, but that you can see flows through the entire economy and will cause complexity through everyone's supply chains.
Yeah.
The second example was actually the major supermarkets here in Victoria, which mentioned that they might have to close stores and limit trading hours because of large portions of their staff being forced to quarantine under the current requirements. Thirdly, which is really interesting, is one of the biggest pressures facing businesses is the inability to recruit. And I guess the rapid digitization of operating models has caused predictable shortages with programmers and the like, but we're actually seeing this and hearing this from businesses across the field, anywhere from the accounts payable clerks to project managers to hospitality staff. It's really difficult to find employees in the current market. And I guess that's interesting given the current situation, but predictable given that the unemployment rate is 4.5%. There's a declining participation rate, and there's no supplemental labour from overseas, or very limited.
Stay with me, James. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to James Wagg, Executive Director at KordaMentha. Okay, so over the next few weeks, this week New South Wales has lifted restrictions and will continue. Victoria theoretically will do the same in a fortnight's time. The ACT, we don't know, but presumably that will happen, given their vaccination rates, that will happen fairly shortly too. That should open up borders to some extent, though we don't know about Western Australia and Queensland, obviously. What I suppose I'm saying is the economy is loosening up somewhat. With that and the reduction in government support, do you think we will see more insolvencies as we go forward the next 3, 6, 9 months?
It's the big question, and I think the results pointed to more uncertainty. And I think some of the reasons that you've just pointed out, when we were discussing this last year, we were pointing to, the light on the horizon, similar to what you've just pointed out. And in reality, we had another year very similar to 2020. So more uncertainty seems to be the theme for next year. And certainly not too many people predicted the first recession in 30 years would lead to labour shortages and booming property and share markets. But the industry really predicts, I guess, markets staying similar, although insolvency should start to increase from their historically low levels. And we've actually seen a small trend over recent months of small uptick. But really, material changes to the economy will only come when borders reopen, as you pointed out. And when that happens is anyone's guess, and government stimulus reducing. But we're seeing this, and this is an international trend as well. The key risks of businesses will continue to be supply chains, employee retention and recruitment, and increasing costs.
Okay, so I appreciate that, but at the moment, everyone's been able to manage that because of government stimulus and low interest rates and flexibility from banks and plenty of cash in the system. Which of those do you think will be the trigger to actually move things more back to normal, which means higher levels of insolvencies? Or do we need a few of them?
We're certainly keeping our eyes on a number of drivers, and some of the obvious ones which we've discussed, and you've mentioned government stimulus and what happens with inflation. Is it transitory or is it permanent? There's another couple of factors that we need to keep an eye on as well. Just the sheer liquidity in the market, I think, means that we'll actually see the continuing mergers and acquisition trend and boom that we've seen with transactions like Afterpay and Sydney Airport being far more prominent in the future, just because there is so much cash in the economy. But I guess the other one that we're looking at is the impact of international travel. Yeah. So it's easy to forget that back in 2019, Sean, international travellers contributed about $40 billion to our GDP, but that was eclipsed by Australians travelling overseas who spent $55 billion. So the impact of closed borders internationally has actually led to a net increase in funds for domestic consumption.
Ah,
And I'm sure there's some pent-up demand for people to leave and travel again. So, and the final factor is just how quickly the CBDs rebound.
yeah.
So certainly here in Victoria, it has such a big impact to our events and hospitality industries, the CBD. And when you look at economies like London and New York, it's taken many months after restrictions have loosened for that demand and that people traffic to actually return, and still it's not there. So just how quickly that returns is going to be a big indicator.
The International Monetary Fund talked about a day of reckoning for zombie companies as support is withdrawn. They did mention Australia in that. Do you think they're correct that it will happen?
Really not sure. I think the industry initially predicted a tsunami of insolvencies, and boy, were we wrong. So it's really uncertain what will happen. I think looking at the statistics, though, we've now had 2 years of insolvency numbers at 50% of pre-COVID levels. So logic would probably say that there will be some flush through and there will be a return to the mean. However, how big that will be is really unknown.
James, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed again.
Thanks very much, Sean.
That was James Wagg, Executive Director at KordaMentha. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.